In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the major episodes in the history of life and the creation of the cells that we see today. And if we look at this figure right here, we can see that it's a timeline of what has happened based on a lot of scientific data that's been collected about the age of the Earth and the creation of various forms of life that have appeared on it. And if you look at the beginning of this, the origin of the Earth is estimated to be about 4.5 billion years ago. And this is really a hard concept to think about. But if you think about whether or not you've lived for 1 billion seconds, in order to live for 1 billion seconds, you would have to be a little more than 31.5 years old. 1 million seconds, you're talking about maybe 11.5 days. So when we're looking at this time frame, it's really, really a long time, and that's something you have to keep in mind when you're considering this idea of the evolution of life. If you look, the first forms of life that we can find now are some prokaryotic fossil evidence that is out there. And that took about 1 billion years. And if you look at the total lifespan for the Earth, we're talking about 24% of the lifespan. So really a quarter of the planet's history went by before we see some evidence of some of these prokaryotic cells that were forming out there. And if you go for another, maybe another 41% of that time frame here, at this point is when we see a major change that is occurring. This is when photosynthetic prokaryotic cells start to appear, and they're going to be producing oxygen. If you remember that process of photosynthesis, you split your water in order to get electrons for your photosystems, and this produces oxygen gas. And this really changed the atmosphere as these prokaryotic cells that carpeted the planet basically started pumping out oxygen. And the oxygen itself is a very, very reactive kind of chemical, and that caused really this switch in the metabolism of a lot of cells on the planet to start using oxygen and doing that aerobic respiration that we learned about previously. And if you remember, aerobic respiration provides a lot more energy or more bang for your buck when you're looking at metabolism of organic molecules. And remember, if you have energy, you're winning that struggle for resources, and that's going to allow you to produce more kids, and that is what drives that evolutionary process by natural selection, that struggle for resources that goes on in populations of cells that are out there. If we go on and look at the evolution that took place after this, we can see that you have the oldest eukaryotic fossils that have been found out there, and this is after about 2.5 billion years of cells continuing to grow on the planet. So more than half of the lifespan of the planet has gone by before we even get the eukaryotic cells appearing, and then those eukaryotic cells were able to diversify and start to form our multicellular organisms that are out there. This is about 74% of the lifespan that's gone by. We can keep going on, and we see the oldest animal fossils here, and then you get what's known as the Cambrian Explosion. And during this period, for some reason, there was this massive increase in the number of species that appeared on the planet, typically in the oceans here, because they hadn't yet gotten onto land. And after 89% of the planet's lifetime has gone by, this is when you start to see plants and fungi actually start to colonize the land. So if you look at this and think about it, really the appearance of eukaryotic cells on land has not been for that long of a period. We're talking about maybe 500 billion or 500 million years at this point. And then we go all the way down here. 99.9% of the history of life has occurred on the planet here, and at this point, this is when we have the evidence that humans and the ape ancestors actually diverged. So really, when you think about humanity's lifespan on the planet, we have been here for a fraction of the time that the planet has been around. And if we think about, okay, how can you go from this process of not having any life out there to having life? There is a hypothesis that consists of 4 stages for the origins of life. And if we think about this process here, the cells today that we're familiar with, those are not created from scratch. Biogenesis is part of the cell theory of life, that life is created from other life. If you take bio for life and genesis as creation, Biogenesis tells us that cells come from other cells, but there's a hole in this biogenesis cell theory of life, and that's that cells had to appear at some point. And this hypothesis for the origin of life is known as abiogenesis. So the creation of life from really nothing. It's spontaneous generation, and this idea held true for really thousands of years because people would see things where life would just appear. If you think about, you have a pile of horse manure sitting outside, and all of a sudden flies start to appear there from the maggots. Where did those come from? Well, life maybe spontaneously appeared. But nowadays, we know really since the 1850s when Pasteur did an experiment and showed that cells come from other cells, we can accept the cell theory of life. But what about abiogenesis? Where did that life originally come from? And it's based on a couple of stages that are out there where you get abiotic synthesis of these molecules. Again, without life, can you get the creation of these molecules here? And if we look at this experiment that was actually performed in the 1950s, Miller and Urey did this experiment where they actually mimicked the early Earth atmosphere. And again, this is based on a lot of guesses that are out there. They guessed, based on a lot of other evidence out there, that the atmosphere contained a variety of different kinds of molecules. There's simple molecules like water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas. And so they made an atmosphere out there to mimic this. And the other part of the hypothesis is there was a lot of lightning in this atmosphere, and so they were actually sparking in there using some electrical apparatus to introduce lightning into this, and they turned up the voltage pretty high. And what happened is that this extra energy that went in there actually was able to result in the production of a variety of different kinds of molecules. And when you look at this thing, they actually had some circulation going on here, and they provided some heat over here to mimic kind of the effect of volcanoes in the ocean. And that drove these molecules up in the atmosphere. They sparked it, and then they ran a water jacket over it to cool down those vapors that were forming, and those basically rained into the sea, and so they let this go. And what they found is there was actually production of amino acids. And kind of an interesting little side thing is that in 2007, some scientists actually found some of the original sealed vials from the experiment that Miller had kept around, and they went ahead and did some more analyses using a little bit more sophisticated kind of equipment, and they actually found there was more than 20 different kinds of amino acids that were produced in this experiment. Other people have shown that if you add some UV light to this, you can actually get water and CO2 to start to form organic acids. And another thing that can come out of here is people have been able to demonstrate that RNA and DNA, the nucleotide bases, can be formed in that organic rich soup in the ocean right there. So if we look at this, it looks like the abiotic synthesis of organic molecules could actually be true. And people have actually been able to show that you can go from monomers to polymers by, again, setting up an experiment in the lab. And if you have clay, it allows these molecules to stick together. And other people have shown that the hypothesis was that meteors have rained organic molecules on the planet. And there is a female scientist who actually took a bullet and filled it up with some monomers and shot it to mimic the fall of meteors on the planet. And then they analyzed the residue that was left over there, and they found that there was actually polymers formed. So it looks like these organic molecules can actually form even in the absence of life. And then if you look at this process here, now we've got these things floating around, and possibly you can start to get the formation of phospholipid bilayers here. Again, remember that idea. Phospholipid bilayers can form spontaneously, and they were able to enclose some of these organic polymers. And then the last step in this hypothesis is that these organic molecules were able to start becoming self-replicating. And we've been able to show this in the lab. Doing experiments that took less than a year, people have actually been able to make chains of RNA molecules that can start to copy themselves. And so overall, when we look at the laboratory evidence, it looks like this process that the life could form spontaneously, it actually does work based on experimental evidence that has been performed in laboratories out there. And at some point, these reactions must have become more and more efficient, and they started to form our early cell.